ChatGPT said, the first scream didn't come from Elizabeth Andes. It came from the officer who stepped into her apartment and realized the quiet little college town of Oxford, Ohio, had just changed forever. Elizabeth, known to her friends as Beth, had always carried a kind of light with her. She was 23, a senior at Miami University, the sort of student professors remembered long after she'd left the room. She wore her brown hair loose, usually tucked behind one ear, as she scribbled notes in fast-looping handwriting. She was warm, funny, the kind of person who remembered everybody's birthday. She dreamed of working with children, maybe becoming a teacher, maybe social work. She wasn't sure yet. What she did know was that she had her whole life ahead of her. And on a cold night in December of 1978, someone stole it from her. Earlier that day, Beth had been packing up her apartment to leave for a new job in Dayton. It felt like a fresh start. Her boyfriend, Bob Young, stopped by to help. Bob was 23 too, tall, polite, the type of guy who apologized even when something wasn't his fault. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it had the sort of gentle rhythm young people often fall into. They argued sometimes. They made up quickly. They talked about the future, but not in a serious ring-on-the-table kind of way. Just the soft, simple words of two people figuring themselves out. Around 6 that evening, Bob left to meet friends. Beth stayed behind. What happened in the hours after that is the dark void at the center of the case. The unanswered question, the shadow no one has ever been able to push away. Just after 9, Bob returned. The hallway outside Beth's apartment was quiet, the building old enough that the radiators groaned like they had their own conversations. He pushed open the door and called her name. No answer. The place looked half-packed, half-lived in. A box of books stacked by the door, a coffee mug in the sink, her winter coat draped over a chair. Nothing seemed out of place. Then he walked into the bedroom. Beth lay on the floor, her body beaten and strangled, her clothes in disarray. Her hands were cold. Her skin was already losing its warmth. Bob dropped to his knees and tried to shake her awake, as if this was some terrible mistake. He kept saying her name, over and over. Beth, Beth, come on, Beth. His voice cracked, and then it disappeared completely. When police arrived, the apartment felt like a crime scene out of a nightmare, but also strangely clean. There were signs of a fight, but not the kind that tears an entire room apart. Nothing was stolen, no forced entry, no broken windows. Whoever did this either walked in freely or was already inside. The first officer on scene later admitted he'd assumed the case would be solved within hours. It looked straightforward. A young woman, a boyfriend who found her, no sign of a stranger breaking in. Detectives focused on Bob almost immediately. They found him too calm, too quiet, too willing to talk. He answered every question. He stayed at the station for hours, going over the timeline again and again. At one point he muttered, I should have stayed with her. I should have never left. It wasn't a confession, it was grief. But investigators didn't hear it that way. Still, nothing about Bob pointed to violence. Friends described him as gentle to a fault. He cried when he talked about Beth, and not in the careful, calculated way officers sometimes look for. These were raw, shaking sobs of a man who had just watched his world collapse. But grief wasn't proof of innocence. And on their whiteboards, under the list of potential suspects, his name was written in thick black marker. The autopsy revealed a brutal truth. Beth had been strangled with a cord and beaten, but there was no clear sign of sexual assault. It was a messy, desperate attack. Something fueled by rage or panic, not the careful planning of a predator. That pushed investigators further, toward the theory they already liked. Crimes of passion are committed by people close to the victim. Lovers, partners, people whose hearts can snap under pressure. Detectives kept Bob at the center of everything. After 2 long interrogation sessions, they claimed he'd made several incriminating statements. He said things they interpreted as guilt, lines such as, if you say I did it, maybe I did. According to the officers, he broke under pressure, but his friends insisted that wasn't a confession at all. Bob was quiet, sensitive, and overwhelmed. They believed he said whatever might make the questioning stop. There was no physical evidence tying him to the murder. No fingerprints that shouldn't have been there. No bloody clothing. No witnesses placing him at the apartment during the time of death. Even the timeline didn't fully line up. But police pushed forward, convinced that their instincts were enough. The trial moved fast. Prosecutors built their case almost entirely around Bob's supposed confession. They painted him as a jealous boyfriend, afraid of losing Beth as she started a new life in another city. They didn't have a motive that fit neatly, but they argued that relationships are often more complicated than people admit. They said he snapped in a moment of anger, then panicked. They said guilt carried him through every moment afterward. Bob sat at the defense table looking hollow, as if he wasn't entirely sure how he'd ended up there. His voice shook when he told the jury he didn't kill Beth. I loved her, he said quietly. I would never hurt her. His lawyers pointed out the holes in the case, the lack of evidence, the sloppy police work, the interrogation tactics. But emotion has a way of filling a courtroom, and sometimes a tragic story feels incomplete unless it has someone to blame. And then, in a moment no one expected, the jury came back with something rare in cases like this. Not guilty. Bob was acquitted, free to walk out of the courthouse. free to rebuild his life, even if the shadow of suspicion followed him like a second skin. But if Bob didn't kill Beth, who did? That question haunted Oxford for decades. The theories multiplied. Some said a stranger had stalked the building and slipped inside unnoticed. Others suspected someone from Beth's past, maybe a man she knew but didn't mention to friends. A few whispered about a drifter passing through town that winter, a man arrested later for assault in another state. One neighbor claimed she saw a figure leaving the apartment around the time of the murder, but her description was vague enough to fit half the male population of Ohio. Another witness mentioned hearing an argument earlier that evening, but she couldn't tell if the voices belonged to Beth or someone on the radio. Every lead had a flaw. Every clue dissolved under examination. Years passed, then decades. Detectives retired. Evidence degraded. The world moved forward, and Beth's case stayed frozen, trapped in 1978 like an insect sealed in amber. In the early 2000s, an investigative reporter reopened the story. He dug into police files, interviewed old witnesses, and discovered something troubling. There had been a second man of interest early on, someone the public never heard much about. He was a co-worker of Beth's, known for quick temper and erratic behavior. He had no solid alibi, and his statements to police were inconsistent. But he was never pursued aggressively because investigators had already locked on to Bob. They didn't want to complicate things. They didn't want to start over. The reporter tracked him down for an interview. When asked about Beth, the man looked away and said, "That was a long time ago." His hands trembled. His breathing changed. And for a moment, the reporter felt he was sitting across from someone hiding a truth too heavy to speak aloud. But suspicion isn't proof. And another suspect was no closer to justice than Bob had been to guilt. One detail still stands out though, something small, almost insignificant, but strange enough that it never fully disappears from the conversation. When police processed the crime scene, they found a faint footprint near the bed. Too small to be Bob's, too large to be Beth's. It didn't match her shoes. It didn't match his. It belonged to someone else. Someone who has never been identified. It's hard to tell whether that footprint represents the real killer or just another loose thread in a case filled with them. But when you follow it through the snow of that winter night, the trail leads only to darkness. Today, people still talk about Beth. Former classmates remember her laugh. Her family remembers the phone calls she never got to make. Her name appears in documentaries, podcasts, articles from journalists trying to shake the dust off a cold case and make it breathe again.